Kirby, everyone's favorite ability-stealing pink sucky guy. Over the years, Kirby's copy ability's gotten a lot of use, with some power-ups being wicked strong and super fun to use, while others are just straight-up trolls. Today, we're gonna look at every single ability Kirby's obtained and rank them from worthless to elite. Starting off with normal Kirby, I guess, he's pretty okay. In a pinch, you can use him to spit stars back at enemies, and it works, but is not ideal. It's probably not fair to rank this against his other actual abilities, but compared to those, plain old Kirby is obsolete. Beam Kirby is a classic, and has always been one of my favorites. It's got great reach, being able to charge up and shoot a giant projectile is awesome, and it's always a super consistent and reliable choice to fall back on. It's been a staple in the series since the beginning, and is at the very least super effective. And I know a couple of these have super abilities, but for this list, we're sticking to the core power-up and not the OP one-off scenarios. Spark is a pretty limited ability. Kirby sits still and radiates a deadly electrical force field that slaughters anything that gets too close, which is cool, and some later iterations make this electricity more vertical, which helps too. Being a more stationary attack though, I'll say it's a decent option. And since they're so similar, let's knock out Plasma too, because they're often confused with one another. Plasma's more versatile, but a lot more gimmicky. Its base attack is a super weak little shock, but if you spam the control pad and move around a lot, you charge up electricity and can send a really powerful shockwave ahead. It's not bad, but since the recharge requires some time and space, it's not nearly as efficient as other abilities, so I'd say it's a bit less ideal than Spark and pretty situational. Fire Kirby's another icon. He's a walking flamethrower that can turn into a flaring fireball to burn straight through enemies. For main levels, this is S tier plus, but in boss fights, the range is a little lacking and the charge goes straight through a lot of foes and isn't as useful as some other abilities. Still super effective overall. And speaking of fire, burning is basically a less ideal version of it. Instead of spitting flames out of his face and morphing into a fireball, he does just the latter, which is still good, but a lot less practical. And since there's an ability that does the same thing and then some, it's going obsolete. Cutter's an ability I've never been all that high on. I think it's fine, but I would never choose this over an actual good one. It's better than a blank Kirby though, so decent option. Crash is a one-time use screen sweeping attack, and it's crazy powerful and impressive, but in application, it's not as useful as something Kirby can keep. It's situational at best. Sword is the Kirby ability. It's super basic and standard, but it's the most famous one in the series for good reason. Kirby's a fucking menace when wielding this thing. He outduels Meta Knight on every single occasion and slays universe-threatening demons because he's hangry. It's a great choice in just about every context, and is borderline elite, but for now we'll say super effective. Ice is another go-to of mine. I always love that Kirby skated around instead of running. It makes gameplay flow a lot nicer, and it's highly effective in just about every enemy scenario. It freezes smaller dudes into ice cubes you can kick into other enemies, and his frosty breath can drain boss health bars pretty quickly. I'd say it's the best one so far, and definitely deserves the first elite tier. And like burning to fire, freeze is a more defensive version of ice, allowing Kirby to stand still and freeze anything that comes too close. Honestly, it's not all that useful. I'd take burning over this by a pretty substantial margin, but they're both obsolete. Needle is a lot like freeze. It stops you in your tracks to be invulnerable to physical attacks. It's okay, but recent games have really buffed the ability, allowing Kirby to turn into a roly spike ball and spear anything that gets in his way. In the old games, it's situational, but in the new ones, it's super effective, so let's average it out to a decent option. Parasol Kirby is pretty freaking garbage. It's an unimpressive attack, and the unique part about it is that it makes him fall slower, which doesn't help that much, unless there's a part of the level that's specifically designed for its use. I want to go worthless here, but it is very situational, and I gotta be fair. Tornado's a pretty creative ability that's really fun to use. Kirby spins at breakneck speeds to form a twister and flies around the screen to cause a world of hurt to all the unlucky badniks nearby. It can be more challenging to control, but it deals a lot of damage in little time, and is without question an elite copy ability. Wheel locks Kirby into a fast-moving and destructive state that's a great choice for whipping through stages and decimating anything that stands in your way, but for boss fights or any situations where you need some air, it's the furthest thing from ideal. In a few select scenarios, it's amazing. Outside of that, poo. So Stone is a pretty easy worthless, I mean, right? It turns Kirby into a solid rock that can't move, and only deals damage if he lands directly on an enemy or is sliding down and hits something. It does have some practical uses, but they're few and far between, and I've never chosen this over anything else. Mike does basically the same thing as Crash, but you get to use it 3 times instead of 1, with each one getting progressively stronger. The funniest thing about this one is that it's just a regular old microphone, and Kirby's singing is so bad that it literally kills everything in sight. I don't like temporary abilities as much as the more permanent prominent ones, but this one's a lot more usable than Crash, and I'm willing to say it's a decent option. Laser's a more obscure Kirby ability that hasn't been seen since Squeak Squad. He fires a horizontal laser that can ricochet off walls, and that's basically it. It's a crappier version of Cutter that's only used to solve simple puzzles, situational, and that's being generous. Sleep, the most notorious, worthless Kirby ability in the history of the series. Get this one by accident, you just lie there and spam every button until he wakes up. This one's literally just there to troll you. High Jump lets Kirby fling himself into the sky and wipe out anything above him, and when it's implemented, it feels really overpowered and good, but outside of those few explicit cases, there's not much practicality to it. It's definitely more situational. Backdrop's up next, but it's a less good version of the Suplex, so we'll put it in obsolete and talk about that instead. Suplex has Kirby charge into an enemy, grab him, and either yeet him forward or slam him into the pavement. It feels really strong and satisfying, but there's way faster ways to get that same point across, and this is just flashy for the sake of it. I would go situational, but there's another ability that slightly outdoes this, so again, obsolete. Throw starts off the same way as Suplex, run up and grab, but this time it allows you to toss the enemy whichever way you want, which can be used to kill more enemies or destroy blocks. Now we got a situational one. Hammer Kirby is absolutely top tier. It's got a wide array of attack options, one that charges and deals a ton of damage, an aerial that covers you all around, and a quick sweep attack when moving forward. It doesn't have any real downsides and is optimal for every enemy encounter. Elite. Light is the polar opposite of Hammer. It only appears in Kirby's Adventure and its remake, and is a one-time use that illuminates a dark room. Yeah, worthless. UFO Kirby is very rarely seen, and that's because it's absolutely broken. It allows Kirby to stay in the air indefinitely and fire all kinds of lethal projectiles, and it honestly makes the game way too easy, which is why in most of its appearances, you lose the ability at the end of the stage you obtain it in. With that being the only downside, it's clear we've got another pretty easy elite. Ball only appears in Kirby's Adventure, and like the name suggests, it turns Kirby into a bouncy ball, which packs a surprisingly powerful punch, but is also impossible to get the hang of. This thing controls like ass, but if you can manage it, it has a lot of upside, so I'll say it's decent. Bomb Kirby's a pretty consistently quality one. He gets unlimited bombs to use however he wants, and it's useful in plenty of situations. Now, I don't love that he doesn't have any melee attack options in this state, but it's basically a glorified Cutter ability with explosions. I like decent option tier for this one. Fighter gives Kirby a slew of martial arts inspired abilities that make kicking ass and taking names easier than ever. He's got a mean uppercut, a quick leg sweep, and some nasty haymakers, sure to make even the most seasoned of fighters quiver in fear. It's gotta go elite. Mirror has an insane amount of reach and is ideal for just about every situation. He glides around like he does in ice form, can rapid fire mirrors at enemies, and send reflections of himself across the screen to maximize slaughter. I think we've got back-to-back elites. Cook is functionally the same as Crash. It kills all the enemies on screen, but now does it in a way more over-the-top way, and even gives Kirby food to heal up afterwards, which makes it slightly better, but it's still a one-time use situational power-up. And with this one, Crash is getting moved down to obsolete. Ninja seems like a really cool one, but it's more style over substance. He's got throwing knives as a projectile, some simple slashes and ninja kicks, a mini suplex, and he can stick to walls. That sounds like a great variety of abilities, and it is, but most of them aren't all that helpful, and the ones that are done better with abilities like Fighter or Sword. It's still a decent option though, no doubt. Yo-Yo's a pretty silly concept, but it's actually one of the better abilities in the series. He's got a ton of range with that thing, can walk the dog and clear a path for himself, grab enemies to whip around like ragdolls, and he's got a more physical spin move and upward strike that are pretty friggin' effective. It's kinda an elite ability, not gonna lie. Wing Kirby makes air maneuverability more manageable than ever before, and if there's any enemies in the sky, they're certified cooked. His longer range Feather Strike attack doesn't do a ton of damage, but it's a nice option, and he's got a great variety of physical diving attacks that pack a pretty punch. I've got a soft spot for this one, but objectively, I still think it's super effective. Copy is an ability that lets Kirby do what he already does to a slightly better degree. There's more things he can scan, but you're better off just inhaling and getting a good power-up. This is worthless. Jet's a pretty mid ability overall. You can charge up and shoot yourself forward to wipe out a line of enemies, and that's it for offense. I think it's supposed to make navigating the skies a bit easier, but something like the wing makes it entirely obsolete in that aspect, so... Paint, another Crash ripoff, obsolete before it even got here. Cleaning is a more obscure Kirby ability, appearing in Kirby's Dream Land 3, and then not again until Star Allies, and in both games, Kirby sweeps with a broom and occasionally pulls in some of his pals to help deal some damage. Not ideal, but situationally solid. Cupid allows Kirby to hover, which he basically does already, and gives him arrows, which do work pretty well, but it was made entirely obsolete by the Archer ability, so real quick, set that there. Okay, Archer. He's got a bow and arrow again, but this time he can very precisely aim it, charge it up to go as far as he wants, and hide behind certain set pieces to allow him to snipe in solitude. He's lacking more traditional physical attacks, which holds it back a little, but he can rip off arrows lightning fast, so it's still ideal for just about every scenario. Super effective. Missile Kirby's a really fun idea, and playing around with it's awesome, but it's hard to control right, only deals damage with a head-on hit, and leaves him susceptible for a second or two after the explosion. Not so great trade-offs, I'll say situational. Smash Bros gives Kirby his Smash Bros moveset, and it translates over really well, and feels crazy familiar, as someone who's played a good bit of Smash, so I really dig this one. I think it deserves Elite, and if you want to see a separate video where I rank all his Smash Bros transformations, let me know below. Magic Kirby is a gambling addict's dream come true. It gives you a roulette wheel that randomly picks a power-up for you, or can just commit mass genocide across the screen. In Kirby and the Amazing Mirror, it's only this one-time use random drawing, but in Squeak Squad, he pulls random shit out of his hat to attack with, and retains the option to test his luck. It's a really rare find, and is basically just a window to other, more practical abilities, so let's go situational. Mini Kirby's the same as normal Kirby, but smaller, and more fragile, so worthless. Balloon Kirby only appears in Canvas Curse, and it makes him inflate to a massive size and float upward, which he only needs because he doesn't have his usual float jump, and since he retains that in basically every other game, it's a pretty worthless ability. Animal only appears in Kirby's Squeak Squad, and it gives him big claws to dig into soft ground and slash the hell out of enemies. It was basically replaced by Drill though, because that lets Kirby dig almost anywhere, and neither of them are all that combat oriented. They're gimmicky and allow for more exploration, so Drill is situational and Animal was made obsolete. Metal Kirby looks great on paper, but in game he kinda sucks. He's practically invincible and deals damage by just existing, but he's also mega slow, heavy, and not ideal for really any situation. It's going worthless. Bubble's another exclusive to Squeak Squad, and in itself is not that great. He shoots bubbles, but it does turn enemies into their abilities and allow Kirby to pick it up to use later. So another ability that makes using other abilities easier. The game wants you to make it obsolete, so Ghost Kirby lets him possess enemies and temporarily control them, which would be cool in like a Mario game, but this dude can already use any abilities he wants, so this is pointless as f***. Worthless. Leaf Kirby has some pretty nice attack options and range. He's got a mini leaf tornado, small little leaf projectiles, and some direct close range moves. He's also got a special shield that lets him hide in a leaf pile and makes him invincible to 99% of enemies, which is super handy too. It's definitely a good ability, borderline a high tier. Whip Kirby is a savage. His little cowboy getup is fire, and while he's not the strongest, he's quick with that thing, he's got reach and a sick grab, and is at least a decent option. Water Kirby can surf on land. Fucking badass. The wave takes out enemies, allows him to cross fiery terrain, and it's just really fun to use. His attack options are a bit limited, but still really solid, and when gameplay's this smooth with an ability, I'm tempted to go really high, so I'm sticking it in super effective. And no, I'm not factoring in Water Kirby in the Forgotten Land, just no. Spear Kirby is kinda a hybrid between sword and cutter. Close range combat is rapid fire and effective like sword, and tossing spears is just as reliable long range as the cutter. And plus, he can spin it super fast to hover for a second, which is extra style points. I think it's at least on par with sword, but not quite elite. Bell Kirby relies on sound waves to do most of the work for him, and those attacks have some solid reach, but when things get up close and personal and he has to use the bells themselves as weapons, it's pretty slow and lacking. Overall, it's a decent option, but definitely on the lower end. Beetle turns Kirby into a bully. He can grab with the giant horn and basically suplex enemies again, and he's got beetle wings that make even his airtime damaging. I know it's lacking a projectile, but when the physical aspect is this good, like it is for Hammer and Fighter, it's gotta go up in Elite. Circus Kirby is a weird idea that was executed well, but that doesn't make it a great ability. All of his circus-inspired moves are visually pretty distinct and creative, but beyond that, it's generally pretty slow and not ideal for fighting enemies. Situational at best. ESP turns Kirby into a Ness ripoff. He's got all these new psychic abilities that are interesting to see and play around with, but don't translate over to a Kirby game as well as you'd hope. Ness mains will go crazy, but most other people would probably only use this very situationally. Dr. Kirby has some fun ideas. He shoots pills and slaps people around with a clipboard, you know, typical doctor stuff. But he can also brew different potions that have varying effects on surrounding enemies. I think it's unique and very functional. It's a decent option for sure. Poison Kirby is a lot like Water Kirby, but it doesn't exactly make it obsolete, since Poison deals less damage up front and instead slowly eats away at enemies. For boss fights, Poison might be a little better because you can chip away at bigger health bars a bit easier, but the slower attack speed and less versatile moveset does drop it a tier, still a pretty alright option. Festival's another ripoff of Crash and Cooking, so it's going obsolete tier. Artist Kirby's a super innovative ability. The base attack of just a paintbrush swing is kinda lame, but his art skills allow him to paint things that come to life and fight for you, and sculpt things he can use to violate enemies. It takes a lot of time to craft the more useful things, so that hurts it a good bit, but I admire the idea a lot, and I'll give it situational. Spider Kirby is a pretty strange concept. Being able to catch enemies in webs and kick them away is kinda fun, and if you can master this ability, the flow is immaculate. Its great maneuverability and range of attacks are incredible strengths, but since the trapping mechanic doesn't work for bosses, you lose the main impactful thing about this ability. It has high upside, but limitations, leaving it as a decent option. Staff is a lot like Spear in the sense that you have a long pokey thing, but you can't throw this one. Instead, it's like twice the length and lets you pole vault over enemies, which makes it feel distinct. It has a ton of speed and range, but no projectiles, which make it kind of a glorified sword with some fun gimmicks, and I think do enough to pull it into super effective. Wrestler Kirby takes the suplex ability and adds other physical attacks to it, which makes it way more usable in those situations, and it still packs a hell of a punch. It's very close range, which is the only downside, but anything lower than super effective would be a crime. Ranger Kirby has a gun. Okay, who gave him a gun? You can fire it fast to land a bunch of hits quickly, or charge it for a more powerful blast, and it's kinda simple, but damn is it effective. Some might even say super effective. I know I would. Jelly's an ability specific to Kirby's Dream Buffet, and maybe it's not fair to compare it to these regular abilities, but I'm still going to. It makes him invincible and allows him to pass through obstacles he normally wouldn't be able to, which is great, but it comes at the cost of being able to deal damage. Not so great. Let's average it out to a decent option. Sand is yet another really creative new ability. He can form a giant fist, build a sandcastle, do a mini high jump, form a freaking tornado. It's a very expansive moveset that feels great. It's kinda similar to Leaf, but it doesn't have a longer range projectile option, which is more than made up for in the sheer variety of moves at his disposal. I really like this one. It's not quite elite and has its limitations, but just below that feels right. Mecha Kirby combines aspects from a bunch of other abilities like the old laser, bombs, and jetpack, and forms one wildly overpowered new one. He feels like a tank and can take down just about anything with ease, making it one final elite to end things on. And there you have it.